Welcome to the Bible Guy. Happy New Year, everyone. It's good to be back with you this year. And I'm just starting today with an introduction to the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark. Going to be doing a series on the Gospel of Mark. Today's introduction, and what we're going to look at today is not being defined by past mistakes. So, not being defined by past mistakes, which we all make. So, let's learn a little bit about the Gospel of Mark. Mark, as we know, was heavily influenced by Peter. If you read the Gospel of Mark, you'll see that it's full of eyewitness details, like you're actually living it through the person themselves. And we know that Mark was definitely a close associate with Peter. There's more Aramaic phrases than any other of the Gospels, which we can see that heavily influence of Peter, like Talitha Kuma, 5 verse 41. Corbin 7 verse 11, hear these words being used. We know 1 Peter 5:13, where we see that association where Peter described Mark as literally as his son. He wasn't literally a son, but he described him as his son. We know of Mark that it was the first, most likely the first gospel written between AD 50 and AD 55. Some details about Mark then. Who was this author of Mark? Well, we know his mother was called Mary, and that the early church met in their house. It's in Acts 12 verse 12. The early church was meeting and praying at Mark's mum's house, called Mary, another Mary. He was also the cousin of Barnabas, and that's in Colossians 4 verse 10, so the actual cousin of Barnabas, who we'll see about in a moment, who he travelled with Barnabas. But one of the main things about Mark is this idea that it's not written to a largely Jewish audience, but it's actually written more to the Roman audience, those who are unfamiliar with Judaism, and that Mark essentially was trying to describe Jesus as God's servant. Because the Romans and society in general didn't really view servants very highly, this is one of the reasons why we think there's no genealogies in there. So genealogies in Matthew and Luke, you see where Jesus came from and his line, but we don't see that in the book of Mark here. No one cares about their pedigree of a servant, so the genealogies aren't in there, so would say. The other thing we see most of in terms of being written to a Roman audience is there's more Latin words being used than any of the other Gospels also. Again, indicating written to the Roman audience, not so much the Jewish audience. And mind-boggling fact about Mark, given that it's the shortest of the Gospels, some say it's the most translated book in the entire world. Most people want to bring the gospel to other countries and nationalities and languages. The gospel that they interpret most of all, the one that I learned growing up in school myself, was the Gospel of Mark. The shortest one, the most punchy, most action. It's all about the deeds, not so much about the words of Jesus. And that's why it's so often referred to. Here's the thing though, and the main theme of what I want us to see today from the introduction to Mark. Mark had significantly messed up. And we see this in the book of Acts. We know in Acts 12, verse 25, we're sort of introduced to Mark. We hear that when Barnabas and Saul had finished their mission, they returned from Jerusalem, taking with them John, also called Mark. But then we hear what happened later on with Paul and Barnabas, and what Mark had done in Acts 15, verse 36. It tells us that sometime later Paul said to Barnabas, let us go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they're doing. Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, his cousin, with them, but Paul did not think it wise to take him. Well, why? Because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement. Paul and Barnabas then parted ways. Barnabas took Mark, they sailed for Cyprus. Paul chose Silas and left and commended the believers. There's such a sharp disagreement that they actually fell out themselves over whether to bring Mark or not. And Mark was wanted to be left behind by Paul because he had deserted them. He didn't carry on the work of the ministry. When things got hard, Mark abandoned and went back home again to the comforts of his home. Paul didn't want them after this. This is a significant failure from Mark's perspective to have been rejected by Paul, because he knew himself it must have been a struggle at that time when he decided to leave them on the mission field and return home again. Why? We don't really know. They know that they'd had troubling times before this around Cyprus, difficult conversions and the difficult interactions with people. And we know that Paul had said, I don't want him with me. And from Mark's perspective, this must have been potentially very troubling. I've really let down these men. I've not continued to work. I gave in to my weaknesses, my desire for comfort. I didn't want the trouble anymore. I lost faith and have a very low view of himself and his own ability to be involved in the mission, to be a follower of Jesus. I abandoned him. As we know, he wasn't the only one who abandoned Jesus, who abandoned him in the time of his need. So to speak here. Obviously, others felt they actively left Jesus and didn't follow him. But this is a significant failure in Mark's life. But what I want to say today is, and the good thing from Mark's perspective as a gospel writer and us, is it didn't define him. We see how Paul felt later on. It's written Philemon 1:24, but also 2 Timothy verses 4 here and 11. Let's see how Paul felt about the man who abandoned him on the mission field at one time. He says, only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you because he is helpful to me in my ministry. How lovely words from Paul about Mark all these years later. Please get him for me because he's useful to me in my ministry. So nice that he said that last part, isn't it? He's useful to me in my ministry. Don't just get him and bring him along as a token gesture. He's useful to me in my ministry. Mark had changed. His past failures did not define him anymore. He was useful to Paul in his ministry. How significant was Mark? How much did he get over his past failures? He is the second gospel writer. Matthew, Mark, of course, the first gospel, the earliest gospel. He is the writer of one of our gospels. How incredible is that? A huge testimony to the fact that he did not let his past failures define him. As we go into this new year, 2022, I'll be looking at more passages from Mark. Do not let our past failures define us. Over Christmas, I had a few days where I overreacted to one of the kids. I felt bad about it later on. I thought, I don't want to let this define me. And I said to the child, I maybe apologized in some cases. I said, I'm sorry for overreacting. And I also want to pass that on to them. When they feel downhearted about their own mistakes, their own failures, their own inadequacies, I say, look, God loves us. He's called us. He wants us to change. He's renewing us every day. We don't have to let the past failures cling to us. Like Jesus said to his followers, shake that dust off your feet. Shake the dust off from yesterday, from last year. Let's move forward with forgetting past mistakes. I take that encouragement from Mark today. We are not defined by our past mistakes. We can go on and look into this year and into the future, and the greatest days are still ahead. Who knows what we can accomplish? Be back with you again very soon. I'm looking at Mark chapter 1. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, share this on for others, and let's get his word out there.